Imagine there was a pregnant woman left on an island after she was promised she'd be rescued within a few months. But no one came back. Days passed, even weeks. The day she was supposed to give birth got closer and closer, but the horizon remained empty. No doctor, no hospital, no way to leave the island. So, who left her there? Why didn't they ever come back? And what happened to her afterwards? Her name was Louise Le Brunou, and unlike most survival stories, she never chose this life. In 1930, a French lobster company sent her and dozens of workers to a tiny volcanic island called Île Saint-Paul, deep in the southern Indian Ocean. Louise wasn't there to explore or settle the island. She was simply accompanying her husband, Victor, who had been hired to work at a seasonal lobster factory. The company assured everyone of one thing: after a few months, a relief ship would return and bring them all home. At first, everything happened exactly as planned. The factory was built, lobsters were processed, and when the fishing season ended, a ship arrived to collect the workers. 23 people climbed aboard and sailed back to France, but 7 people were told to stay behind and guard the camp until the next crew arrived. Among them were Victor and Louise, who was heavily pregnant. It wasn't supposed to be a sacrifice. They'd only be waiting another 2 or 3 months. Nobody argued with the decision because it sounded reasonable. The camp was still standing, there were supplies to last for a while, and another ship was expected before long. For the 7 people left behind, this wasn't a desperate fight for survival. It was simply a temporary job. They watched the ship disappear beyond the horizon, convinced they'd be seeing another one soon. At first, nobody panicked. Ships were delayed all the time. Bad weather could easily add a few extra days to a journey, especially in these waters. So each morning, someone would look out across the ocean, expecting to see a ship slowly emerging on the horizon. Every evening, they told themselves it would probably arrive tomorrow. Tomorrow became another tomorrow, and then another. While they waited, Louise faced a terrifying reality that nobody wanted to talk about. Her due date was getting closer. Every passing week made it more likely that she would give birth on one of the most isolated islands in the Indian Ocean. If something went wrong, there wasn't a doctor for thousands of kilometers, no medicine, no hospital. The people around her could build a lobster factory, but none of them knew how to deliver a baby. Then the waiting quietly turned into something much darker. The weeks became months, yet the horizon remained empty. No relief ship, no supplies, no explanation. Somewhere between hope and fear, the 7 people began asking themselves a question that should never have needed an answer. Had the company simply forgotten they were still alive? At first, the group blamed the weather. Then, they blamed bad luck. Eventually, they stopped making excuses altogether. Every sunrise began with someone climbing the island's cliffs to search the horizon. Every sunset ended with the same empty ocean. By now, the question wasn't when the ship would arrive anymore. It was whether anyone even remembered they were there. As hope faded, another problem quietly appeared. One night, a fire tore through part of the camp, destroying most of the fresh food they had stored. From that moment on, their meals became painfully repetitive: canned beef, hard biscuits, and whatever fish or lobsters they could catch. Nobody complained much. They still had something to eat. Nobody imagined that this ordinary-looking diet would eventually decide who lived and who died. Then, on the 26th of March, 1930, something extraordinary happened. Louise gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Against every expectation, both mother and child survived. They named her Paul, after St. Paul Island itself. For the first time in months, laughter returned to the camp. The 7 castaways convinced themselves that surely no company would leave a newborn baby stranded on an island. Rescue had to be close. But rescue never came. Instead, the island seemed to grow quieter with every passing week. Paul became weaker. Louise watched helplessly as her daughter slowly slipped away, knowing there wasn't a single doctor within thousands of kilometers. When Paul died just weeks later, Victor and Louise built a tiny coffin from an empty food crate and buried the only child ever born on St. Paul. There were no flowers to place on her grave, because nothing grew on the island. Not long after the funeral, something even more disturbing began happening. Emmanuel Pouloc complained that his legs were swelling. Soon his gums started bleeding. Then another man became too weak to work. Then another. It spread so slowly that nobody noticed the pattern at first. But once they did, one terrifying thought crossed everyone's mind. Was there something on this island that was killing them? The strange part was that it didn't look like starvation. They still had food. The sea around them was full of fish. Lobsters were everywhere. If they weren't starving, then what was causing perfectly healthy men to collapse one after another? Nothing about it made sense. It was as if the island itself had become poisoned. Desperate for answers, the survivors searched through an old medical handbook that had somehow survived the fire. The book pointed to a disease sailors had feared for centuries: scurvy. The symptoms matched almost perfectly: bleeding gums, swollen limbs, crushing exhaustion. At first, discovering its name felt like a breakthrough, but within moments, that breakthrough created an even bigger mystery. Scurvy was supposed to happen when people had nothing to eat. These people still had food every single day, so why were they dying anyway? The old medical handbook hadn't been wrong. The illness was scurvy, but the disease itself wasn't the real mystery. What caused it was. After the fire destroyed most of their fresh food, the group had survived almost entirely on canned beef and hard biscuits. They were eating enough to stay alive, but not enough to stay healthy. Month after month, their bodies were slowly running out of vitamin C. By the time they understood what was happening, it was already too late. Emmanuel Pouloc died first after weeks of agony. François Ramamanzi followed, then Victor Le Brunou. The island wasn't killing them. Their own food was. Louise wasn't spared either. Her legs became swollen, her body grew weak, and she too developed scurvy. Yet while barely able to stand herself, she continued nursing the remaining men and took on the hardest jobs around the camp. The survivors eventually realized fresh meat and bird eggs contained just enough nutrients to slow the disease. They began catching fish, seabirds, and collecting eggs whenever they could. It was the only reason anyone survived long enough to see another ship. By autumn, only 4 people were still alive. Time had stopped meaning anything. Then, on the 27th of October, 1930, the youngest survivor, Pierre Quillevic, made one final decision. He dressed in his best clothes, climbed into the camp's only small boat, and pushed away from the shore. Ahead of him lay nothing but thousands of kilometers of open ocean. It was an impossible journey. But staying on St. Paul no longer seemed any safer. Pierre was never seen again. More than a month later, on the 6th of December, a ship finally appeared. But it wasn't a rescue mission. The crew had simply arrived to begin the next lobster season, completely unaware that 7 people had been abandoned there for 9 months. They expected to find an empty camp. Instead, 3 exhausted survivors slowly emerged from the ruins. Louise was one of them. But even after everything she had endured, she made a decision nobody expected. She refused to leave. Louise couldn't bring herself to abandon the island, while Victor's body and little Paul's grave remained there. She stayed on St. Paul for another lobster season, and her eldest daughter, Maria, was even brought to the island the following year. Years later, Louise would write about everything she had lived through, ensuring the story could never disappear with the people who died there. One survivor summed up the island in a single haunting sentence: "On this island where you have nothing, you have a cemetery." When the survivors returned to France, the scandal exploded. Newspapers called them the Forgotten of St. Paul and the Slaves of the Island of Death. Families took the company to court, and in 1937, the judges ruled that the fishing company was responsible for abandoning its workers. But during the trial, the company's lawyer made an astonishing claim. He argued that scurvy wasn't to blame at all, that the victims had died from a mysterious illness caused by canned food, something he called maladie des conserves. The court rejected the argument, yet justice never truly arrived. The company declared bankruptcy before paying Louise or the victims' families a single franc. If this tragedy had been a one-time mistake, perhaps history would have forgotten it, but it wasn't. The very next season, another poorly fed crew arrived on St. Paul, and 44 workers died of beriberi, another disease caused by severe vitamin deficiency. It proved the real danger had never been the island itself. It was the people running it. Today, St. Paul is silent once again. The factory has collapsed into rusting ruins, and only the wind crosses the island where Louise once waited for a ship that never came. But nearly a century later, memorials in both France and on St. Paul carry the names of the forgotten, ensuring that Louise, little Paul, and the others will never be left behind again.